Mixing samples and beats isn't just about adding an EQ and just calling it a day. It's actually way more than that. Today I'm gonna be diving in. I'm gonna break down how I mix my samples, how I mix my beats, and I'm also gonna show you a couple of cool tricks which you can just apply to your mixing. If your beats sound muddy and you don't know how to process your samples, this is the right video for you. So let's just get into it. So before I even jump in FL Studio and show you practical examples, I want to talk about frequency spectrum first. So what is frequency spectrum? That's the range of frequencies and sounds that we hear. Our ears, they can hear anything from 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. Now every single sound that we hear, like every single element, whether it's a kick or a hi-hat or a sound, they always take a specific place from the frequency spectrum. So the kick is always going to be taking up the low end part of the frequency spectrum. The hi-hats are usually going to be up, like way up. You might ask, why is this important? Well, it's all about frequency balance, like just finding that balance in the whole frequency spectrum whenever you're cooking up a beat. So I'm gonna talk more about this a little bit later, but just think of it that way. So let's take an example. You have a muddy beat. Well, that's probably gonna be because you have bad sound selection and you haven't leveled your sounds the right way. If your beat sounds very muddy, I can guarantee you that's because the low end is way too up, or you just don't have enough high end. So the whole frequency spectrum is not balanced. Like either the beat is way too sharp and it has too much high end, or you did something wrong and the low end is very muddy. So here's a perfect example of this. As you can see, we're using the exact same elements, the exact same sounds, exact same sample. Only difference is in the leveling and the whole frequency balance. Now let's jump in the FLP of this beat and I'm gonna break it down for you guys. Okay, so first off, let's begin with the drums and let's talk about leveling. So here we have our beat, right? And right off the bat, the first thing you can notice is how I've leveled my sounds. So let's start with the kick. The kick is always gonna be the wildest part of your whole beat. Like it's gonna be above the sample, it's gonna be above the vocals, like it's gonna be the wildest sound you can possibly have. Or if you don't have a kick and you're using an 808, that's also probably most of the times gonna be the sound that's gonna be sitting on top of everything else. Now whenever you're mixing, do not be afraid to push your kick up. Like the whole point is, if you want to have a punchy kick, you actually want to be pushing it above 0 dB, or you just want to be aiming around that 0 dB range, because the way the soft clipper works, since a lot of people have soft clipper on their master, the soft clipper isn't gonna take any signal and it's not gonna start working until you push it past 0 dB. So in this case, I just have my kick a little bit over 0 dB, so it's just clipping, but like very lightly, not too much. Now moving on to the bass, or the 808, sub bass, whatever. If I have a kick, I'm always gonna keep it around -6 dB to -9 dB. You just want it to stay at a level where it's not too loud, but it's also loud. Like you can hear it, you can feel it. So in this case, I have it around -9 dB. But the other thing to consider when you're mixing low end is also how loud is your high end, like the hi-hats, how loud you have the hi-hats, because again, we're talking about the frequency balance. So if your kick and sub bass are way too loud and your hi-hat isn't loud, it's just gonna be off and you're gonna have a muddy beat. Or if your hi-hats, claps, they have too much high end and they're way too loud, the beat is gonna sound like it doesn't have any low end and it's gonna sound very sharp. Moving on to the hi-hat. Now with hi-hats, you can just it all depends on the sound that you're using for the hi-hat, but usually what I like to do is I will keep the hi-hat under the clap and under the snare. So for me, whenever I'm mixing, the snare and the clap are always gonna be around -6 dB. And the hi-hat can be anywhere from -9 dB to -12 dB. Again, it just depends on the other elements and how they're laid out in the beat. So in this case, I have it around -12 dB. So moving on to the clap and the snare, as I said, I usually leave them around -9 dB to -6 dB. So in this case, I have my clap at -9 and the snare is at -6 dB. So when you play it all together, like, it all sounds like right in its place. Of course I can boost the hi-hats, but you know, that's gonna take off from the low end. Now let me show you two examples of how whenever I boosted the hi-hats and, you know, the clap and the snare, so basically I introduced more high end to the beat, you're gonna see how the low end starts to sound more weak. So as you can see, like in the second example, the kick is way more punchy, but even though it's the exact same level. Whenever you're mixing, you just gotta use your ears. Like, don't exactly stick to, you know, -9 dB, negative whatever dB. So you just want to think about which element you want to be the loudest. And you know, after that, you just level everything based off of that. Like, a great example of this is, you can just think of it as, for example, you have 10 people in the room. If everybody starts screaming, like, you can't hear anybody, like everybody is screaming. But if you have one guy that's screaming and 9 people which are, you know, just sitting and talking at a normal level, you're always gonna hear the guy which is, you know, screaming. So yeah, whenever you're mixing, you want to think which guy do you want to scream. Like, do you want the kick to scream, or do you want the hi-hats to scream? Like, it just depends. Now, next thing, I want to talk about frequency balance once again. So whenever I play this beat and you look at this EQ, you're probably gonna notice that apart from the clap and the snare, like, we have a very visible dip here. So, you know, this space is empty. Now the goal is to have the mids and the high mids empty in your beat. You don't want to have elements which are, you know, taking up this whole place. And the reason for that is, this is where the vocals sit. So let me play this vocal, and you're gonna see that around the mid and the high mid, this is where the, you know, the essential information of the vocal sits. Everything else is just low end and high end. But like, the essential information is here, in the mids to high mids. So what you want to do is, whenever you're cooking up, you want to carve out this space in the mid to high mids range, which is, you know, gonna be available for the vocal to come in.
Look how far we made it. I told them they thought I was crazy. I'm gonna be hot. Jump in the spot, it got raided.
And that's also another thing to consider whenever you're using samples. So for example, if I take this sample right here, you can see the way I made the sample is, the low end is empty, so, you know, you have enough space for the kick, sub bass, all that stuff. Also, the high end is very empty, like, it's very open. So here I can lay down the hi-hats and I don't have to turn them all the way up so they can sound like clear. Mids to high mids, I've left it open. So when you add everything together, you can see, apart from the clap and the snare, you have a very visible, you know, gap here.
3 phones, rocking the long, told the whole leave me be long. I didn't cheat and charm, covered you on to each his own. Had to find my space, I was just keeping my mind straight.
So to conclude, every single element has to have its own place in the sample, in the beat, in the drums. Like, you just want to center everything around the vocal. So you want to have the mids to high mids, you know, the less busy parts. And between the sample and the drums, like, you just want to level them right, so the high end isn't doing too much, but it's also not too weak, because, you know, it's either gonna sound too harsh or it's gonna sound too muddy. And same goes for the low end. Like, you want to make sure you're taking out the low end of the sample. I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna show you how I mix my samples, like how to process your samples, and after that I'm just gonna add some drums and, you know, just walk you through the whole process. So here I have the sample, I'm gonna play it. And once again, you can notice the low end is empty, the high end, not too much is going on. And, you know, here we have this space, and the high mids and the mids. Let's move on to mixing and how I process my samples. So this is how the sample sounds without any processing. Very boomy, very unbalanced, like it doesn't sound as clean. What I always do is whenever I start recording, it doesn't matter if you're recording guitar or you're using VSTs or any other instrument, I always take every single layer and I route it to a separate mix bus, so I have better control of just the way I want to shape it. So for example, I have this first layer. You can obviously hear that it's very boomy, like the low end is out of control. If I move on to the other layers, they don't have this problem. Like I'm using strings which are higher up, so they naturally have more high end and have less low end. So if I were to take all these layers and just put them in one mix track and then I EQ everything, the sample is gonna sound way off. Like you gotta go in and just take every single layer and shape it individually. So here I came in, I'm listening, and hey, we have these low end jumps. So I just take a basic EQ and I just dip this. I don't have to do anything else. I noticed that we have some harsh frequencies. All I do is I just play and I just listen. Like you gotta be mixing with your ears, not just looking at the EQ. So all I did was I just took out the harsh frequencies. Like especially this frequency, it stands out so much. Like it's very sharp, and the more you mix and the more you work with frequencies, the more you're gonna develop this ear for just catching what sounds off. Now moving on to the second layer, once again you can see that I took out the harsh frequencies. And moving on, before I route all these layers to a mixing track, a mix bus, where I'm gonna be applying all the effects which go on everything, what I like to do is I always take every single layer and I just pan it individually. It's way better to just take every single layer and then you just pan it individually. So for example, you have a piano here, you have a bass here, you have a guitar there. Like it just makes the sample sound way more dimensional, because imagine if everything was just panned here, like it wouldn't be interesting. So now what I do on my mix chains, I always start with noise removal. So you don't want to have white noise all in your samples. Doesn't matter if you're recording something live or you're using a plugin. So a lot of piano plugins, for example, if you boost the high end to make it more clear, they start adding like a lot of white noise. So it's always a good habit to just take out the white noise and just stuff that shouldn't be in the sample. After that, I always add like an EQ which works on top of every single layer. And again, here I'm just taking down the low end a little bit. Moving on, I always add reverb. So the thing with reverb is you don't have to add too much, because the way it is, all the sounds are usually dry. Whenever we record something through a mic or you're just using a VST, the sounds are usually gonna be dry. And if you want to make it sound more natural, because the way our ears work, if something doesn't have a little bit of reverb, like it just sounds unnatural. So all I'm doing is here I'm just adding like a tiny bit of reverb, so it just sounds like you're in the room, like you would hear it in the room. Like you can just see how much of a difference it makes, even though it's like a tiny bit of reverb. Here comes the creative part of the mixing. So far I've just been using mixing just to enhance the sample, and here I come in and I just want to add something which is a little bit more creative. I always use this delay, which is ping pong delay. Now what this does is it just adds tiny bit of textures, just delays which bounce off like from one ear to the other, and it just adds a little extra. So whenever I stop it, you're gonna hear it. it just adds like a little texture. And now for the stereo shaper, like this is where the magic happens. This is probably like my favorite plugin inside of FL Studio. Let me play it without and with, and you're just gonna see like every single sound just comes in the right place whenever I put it on. Like it just makes everything so wide and just creates the sense of dimension. So that's pretty much it. And whenever you play the sample, like you're gonna see, okay, I don't have low end. So what you want to do is you just want to add an element which is easy to take out and be replaced with an 808, a kick, anything. Logically, I would go in and I would add a bass right here. And for the textures, I just want something which is gonna fill out the high end, but it's not gonna be too prominent. So it's not gonna take up any space from the vocals or the hi-hats, the snares, the claps, all that stuff. Okay, and now let's move on to me making a beat. Like I'm gonna walk you through the drums, sound selection, all that stuff. For this purpose, no pun intended, let's use the sample. So first things first, you just take the sample and we're gonna route it to a mix bus. What we're gonna do here is I'm gonna take out the low end. So I'm gonna go here, high pass, and just cut out anything that's past 150. And let's move on to adding drums. So I'm not gonna use a kick, I'm just gonna use an 808 since I already showed you how I mix kicks and sub basses. So this time I'm just gonna show you how to mix like an 808, how to get this crunchy sound. And also an important thing, like you want to level your sample, like the melody, somewhere around -9 dB. Like you don't want it too loud, but you don't want it too low. So let's start with adding drum sounds. Now for this purpose, I'm gonna be using my Drum Essentials kit, which I dropped recently. Everybody has been loving it, and you can go get it from the description. It's completely free. Alright, so first off, let's start with the clap. Now second, when it comes to the hi-hats, since we're in 138 BPM, like it's this range where the beat is not too slow, but it's not too fast. So you want something in between, because usually whenever you're working with beats, if it's a lower BPM, you want to be using sounds which are longer. It's gonna fill out more of the space. And if you're working with beats which are higher in BPM, for example like 160 BPM, you want to be using sounds which are shorter and more snappy, so it's gonna be more bouncy. I'm just gonna use this one. Now after that, let's add the 808. So I think here I'm just gonna go with the spin since everybody uses this. You probably want to know how to mix it the right way, like how to mix it like these type beat producers. Another reason why I picked the sample is because you can see the root notes here for the 808 are very low, and most people would usually avoid this and they would just pitch up the sample, or they wouldn't use this. But actually you can use 808s which go as low as G sharp or G4, and it's still gonna sound good. So I'm gonna show you how. As I said, like the lower you go in the octave range, the longer the sounds are gonna be. So the 808 is gonna sound muddy, but you can avoid this by just shortening the 808. So for example, I'm just gonna take this and I'm gonna go like 43%. I'm just gonna shorten it here. I'm also gonna set it to cut itself. I'm gonna add the 808 and it's still gonna punch, and it's not gonna sound like shit. Okay, so let's just take this. Now we're gonna boost the 808. Let's just add this to the mix bus. So here, since we're working with an 808 which is lower in the octave, we want to balance this out by adding more high end. So for the clap, I'm just gonna go a little bit under -6 dB. And for the hi-hat, I'm gonna be aiming for -9 dB. So this cool thing which I like to do is on the hi-hats I always pan them to one side, but after that I add this plugin which is called Pancake. It's sitting here, but it's also like moving into one side of your ear. Now let's spice up the hi-hat a little bit. Alright, something like this. Now let's move on and add a snare. Again, you can see like we have this clear space here for the vocals, and whenever we add the sample, again, we have this whole space for the vocals. Now, what about the master? So we can still spice up this beat and, you know, just make it even more clean and more clear. So the first thing that I like to add on the master is gonna be this, an imager. So whenever you want to play your beats on big speakers, which are probably in the clubs or, you know, venues and all that stuff, these speakers are only mono. So what you want to do is you want to take the low end and you just want to make sure that it's mono. So anything under 200 Hz has to be mono. That's gonna make your beat sound way more clean. Like you can just hear the low end is a little bit more tame and, you know, sounds more tight. Now the second thing that I like doing is, you know, just add a little bit more clarity to the whole beat. So I would usually just take an EQ and I would just boost the mids and the high end a little bit, not too much. Now you can do this with plugins like Fresh Air or, you know, stuff like that, but the way I like to do it is, you know, just using the most basic EQ. This is what I use. I like this because it's less graphical and, you know, this forces me to use my ears instead of just, you know, mixing using my eyes. And that's another thing, like, don't mix with your eyes. Like, you listen to music with your ears, not your eyes. That's pretty much all I have for my master bus. And you can see the beat sounds clean, it's punchy, it has high end, and it has space for the vocals right here. So I hope you liked this video and you found it helpful. Let me know in the comments, like, if you like this, go get the free drum kit, and until next time.